Okay, everybody, hello and welcome to the presentation. Happy Good Friday to you wherever you are in this beautiful world. Hopefully it's been a good Friday for you. I did get to speak to Miss Wilma today. That was nice. She seems to be in good good spirits. So that's good. I was really happy, and I talked to her today, and so that I like that. She was laughing, and that's always a good thing. So we're very happy about that. And for those of you who don't know, Miss Wilma is a good friend of mine, and she's just been struggling a lot lately with her health. And so there we go. So I think she is going to be going to the rehab. And I forgot to push the button there. Okay, so let's get into the presentation, everybody. If you want to go to my website because you're really bored and have nothing else better to do, well, you can go to bishopjameslong.com, bishopjameslong.com. That is my website. There's a couple things, by the way. Well, let's get into the other business, the church's website. Okay, so already the trolls are coming in, so let's just go ahead and take care of this problem. Goodbye, trolls. Leave it there. You can't even troll. You can't even refrain from trolling on Good Friday. Boy, I tell you what, my spirit really irritates your demons, doesn't it? All right, so now sub chat only is on. Pity. If you want to go to the church's website, it's usocc.org. That is the church's website, usocc.org. Let me remind everybody, guys, we have tonight, we have our night prayer coming up. So we start at 9:50 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's when we start the chat. All right, Brenda. So the chat is at 9:50, and then our night prayer starts at 10 p.m. Eastern. You don't need anything. Everything's provided for you. You just be present. Just be present. And that would be wonderful. So if you want to participate in a Good Friday service, if you will, then tonight for night prayer, you're invited. I want to invite, if you would please, also consider, we did get a wonderful donation recently from an anonymous that really helped us out tremendously on the retreat. We still need to raise some more money to catch up, but that really put us in thank God, a blessing. So if you want to help us out, we have a big church retreat coming up next week. By the way, next week I will not be here. So next Friday there will not be a show because I will be at a retreat center, the church's retreat. It's a big celebration. There's going to be quite a few people there, which is good. And there's always expenses. So if you would help us out, that would be wonderful. You can go to usocc.org, click on the retreat button. And I just have not had time to update the website. I just haven't had time. I do 17 homilies a week. So I was trying to put the cash or the Venmo up there, but 17 homilies a week plus a show on Friday. Give me a break. So I don't have the time. But anyway, you can just go to usocc.org, click on the retreat button. And if you can make a donation, please do. Because we're still kind of behind, and so we're trying to play catch up. We don't get paid as clergy, and we pay for our own way, and it's expensive. It is expensive. So thank you guys for doing that, and thank you for helping the church community so that we can have a retreat. Retreats are not cheap, and then when people cancel, that brings a whole bigger issue. And so we've had a couple issues of like that. So anyway. usocc.org retreat. Thank you, guys. Today is Good Friday, and it is a very holy day, certainly. And normally, as you all know, I always do a paranormal show on Friday, for those of you who are new here. This is the only day of the week, one day of the week, just one, where I actually do a paranormal show. Every other day, every Monday through Friday, we have night prayer. Sundays and Wednesdays, we have Bible study, and then Saturday is open mic. So otherwise, it's every day. It's really kind of devoted to theology. So this today is dedicated to the paranormal. Now, because today is Good Friday, I kind of have a a tradition where I always present the miracle of the crucifixion. And I absolutely call it a miracle because it is a miracle. And we'll talk about why I believe that in a moment, where I will give you not only historical information on the crucifixion, but also the medical explanation of what Jesus actually endured when he was being crucified. You know, I have friends of mine that are not Christians. That's fine. If that's what they want, that's their right. But one thing that I'm very intolerant on are people who mock Jesus, especially on this special and holy day. Even if you don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the fact that you would mock a human being who endured suffering and pain that you and I could not even fathom. I mean, you can't even fathom. The crucifixion is not, it's not a quick ending. It is a very painful. And we're going to talk about why I also believe that the crucifixion, in my opinion, proves once and for all that Jesus was not just a human being. Impossible. Impossible. And I'll explain that as we get into this presentation. So again, folks, tonight we're going to talk about the crucifixion and the miracle of the crucifixion. And we're also going to talk about the Shroud of Turin. Now, what you see here on the screen here for you guys, and you guys on KGRDB, that is a Shroud of Turin. That is something that I purchased, a friend of mine, a priest actually friend of mine, when he was in Rome. And when the shroud was laid out and people were allowed to place items on the shroud, which therefore would be considered a relic. This was actually placed, for you guys, it's here. For you guys, it's there. That was actually placed on the shroud. So that is considered now a relic. Now, you guys can't see it, unfortunately, the picture, but for those of you on KGRDB and Facebook and all that, you guys can see this picture here. I'll show you. There. I was at an actual paranormal conference, and when I saw that from a distance, and I thought, I got to get it. I have to get it. It was just one of the most powerful pictures I've ever seen of Christ. However, in saying that, as awful as this picture is, it still doesn't really do the crucifixion justice. I think this is very much a PG version of the picture of the crucifixion. So again, I'll show you for those. I think that's more of a PG. I absolutely do not believe that even comes close to what the crucifixion actually was like. So that's what we're doing tonight. All right. And we're going to get into it. And then we'll get also into our Shroud of Turin and why I believe it. So tonight's presentation is really on the miracles. The miracle of the crucifixion and the miracle of the Shroud of Turin. And then later on, maybe I'll open the chat up to everybody. I had to turn it off because trolls couldn't behave. All right. I had a doctor on my show several years ago, maybe 10 years or so. And I asked him about the crucifixion and if he could explain from a medical perspective what Jesus would have endured. And many of this presentation is from the notes that I had as he studied the crucifixion in great detail. So let's get started. One of the most painful things for me, personally, I think, is to see Jesus mocked. Not because of beliefs. So let's just let those beliefs set aside for a moment. Let's set aside that he is our Messiah and that he did become human, visible form of the almighty, invisible God. What hurts me the most, I think, about mocking Jesus is the very little respect that people have for the real pain that he endured during the last day of his life. Now, there are people that's going to, because this story upsets people because they want to say it never happened. They are liars. There is unbelievable, 100% historical proof that Jesus absolutely was a person. We have historians, non-Christian historians from the first century who write about Yeshua of Nazareth, that many people claimed as the Christus, that people called him God, that people worshiped him, that he was crucified. So anybody who says that there is no historical documentation showing the proof of Jesus, they are absolutely idiotic. They are truly ignorant when it comes to history, because it is not, what they're saying is not true. Now, for those of you who would like to know the sources, because people always think now they're experts in sources, I'll be happy to share those sources with you to prove, in fact, that Jesus did walk the face of this earth. The first century Roman Tacitus, who considered one of the most accurate historians of the ancient world, mentioned superstitions, Christians, from Christus, it's Latin for Christ, who suffered under Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. Also, Flavius Josephus is really the most famous Jewish historian, and in his Antiquities, he refers to James, the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. There is a controversial verse in chapter 18, verse 3 that says, "Now there was about this time Jesus a wise man, if it be lawful to call him a man, for he was one who wrought surprising feats. He was the Christ. He appeared to them alive again on the third day, as the divine prophets had foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things concerning him." One version reads, "At the time there was a wise man named Jesus. His conduct was good, and he was known to be virtuous. And many people from among the Jews and other nations became his disciples." So we know that Flavius Josephus writes about Yeshua of Nazareth. Also, Julius Africanus quotes the historian Thallus in a discussion of the darkness that actually followed the crucifixion of Christ. So there was an eclipse. And there is historians who write about this eclipse, this complete darkness that occurred at 3 p.m. when Christ passed away. Pliny the Younger, in chapter 10, verse 96, recorded early Christian worship practices, including the fact that Christians worship Jesus as God. They were very ethical, and he includes a reference to the love feast at the Lord's Supper. The Babylonian Talmud, Sanhedrin 43a, confirms Jesus' crucifixion on the eve of Passover and the accusations against Christ practicing sorcery. I can give you a massive list of historical writers that were not Christians who write about Jesus of Nazareth. Therefore, anyone who says Jesus did not exist it's intellectually dishonest. It's simply not true. Okay, thank you, guys. So I think what hurts the most is knowing how badly Jesus was mocked. And even today, that people have very little respect for the real pain that he endured. So this presentation is to present to you what he endured during his crucifixion. So when atheists or even non-believers mock the cross, it upsets me because they're mocking the suffering of another human being, even if they don't believe Jesus is the Messiah. But we do know that he was crucified. See, that in essence is dehumanizing yourself for your own personal entertainment. It's not only despicable, it's heart-wrenching. When did we grow so cold and callous? When did our hearts become like stone and mock such pain? Well, where is the tolerance and respect for equality for Christ? See, you can choose not to believe in him as the Son of God, and you can choose not to accept him as your Savior, but you cannot choose whatever you wish and deny his human suffering and that he was crucified. So let's get into the crucifixion. This information obviously is also extracted from articles that's written by physicians. Thank you. I'm not a physician, obviously, but I think that these presentations will open your eyes. All right. But of course, the physical passion of the Christ began in Gethsemane. the many aspects of the initial suffering. One of the greatest physiological interest is the bloody sweat. It's interesting that in St. Luke, the physician, St. Luke was a physician, is the only one to mention this. And he says, and in being in agony, he prayed the longer, Jesus, and his sweat became as drops of blood trickling down upon the ground. Every trick imaginable has been used by modern scholars to explain away this description, apparently under the mistaken impression that it just doesn't happen. A great deal of effort could have been saved had the doubters consulted medical literature. Though very rare, it is an actual phenomenon called hematidrosis. It's a bloody sweat. It's well documented. Under great emotional stress of the kind that Jesus suffered, tiny capillaries in the sweat glands can break, thus mixing blood with sweat. And this process might well have produced a marked weakness and possible shock. So hematidrosis had been seen in patients who've experienced extreme shock to their system or stress. And a case history is actually recorded in a young girl who had a fear of air raids in World War I. She actually developed the condition after a gas explosion occurred in the house next door. Another report mentions a nun who was threatened with being unalived by the swords of the enemy soldiers. She was so terrified that she bled from every part of her body and died of hemorrhage in the sight of our assailants. Now, scripture says after the arrest in the middle of the night, Jesus was next brought before the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas, the high priest. And it is here that the first physical trauma was inflicted. A soldier hit Jesus across the face for remaining silent when questioned by Caiaphas. The Roman soldiers were brutes. This wasn't a slap. This was a punch. And Roman soldiers were quite powerful and strong. And it's quite possible that there would have been damage done to the eye socket or a part of where Jesus was hit. The palace guards then blindfolded him. They mockingly taunted him. And as they passed by, they spat upon him and then struck him in the face. And then they were mocking him, saying, "Oh, who did it? You're the Son of God. Who did it? And then this person hit you. What? Who?" And they would consistently punch him. So now he was bleeding from this anticipation of knowing what the crucifixion meant. And then he was blindfolded and punched in the face repeatedly. Thank you. Now, in the early morning, battered, bruised, incredibly dehydrated, probably still sweating, exhausted from his sleepless night, Jesus is taken across the praetorium of the fortress Antonia. It's the seat of the government of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Now, I think you're obviously familiar with Pilate's action in attempting to pass responsibility to Herod. So Jesus apparently suffered no physical mistreatment at the hands of Herod. He was returned to Pilate. So Pilate is unable to convince the crowds of Jesus' innocence and orders Jesus, and of course they ordered him to be put to death. Some sources state that it was Roman law that a criminal that was to be crucified had to be flogged first. Others believe that Jesus was flogged first by Pilate in the hope of getting him off of a lighter punishment. The problem is this with Pilate's situation. So Pilate was not going to have Jesus crucified because Jesus was claiming to be the Messiah. Pilate really didn't care. That wasn't an offense so grave that you would crucify a person. They didn't care. What Pilate had to do was he had to crucify him. Once the Pharisees said that Jesus was claiming that he is the king of the Jews. Once you claim that you're the king, or that there was these people claiming that he said this, then there was that was an offense, that crucifixion, because that was an attack on Caesar. Pilate had no choice at that time. He had no choice. His hands were tied. He had to have Jesus crucified. This is why he asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Because that offense, then there was no choice. So in spite of his efforts, the Jews allowed Barabbas to be released, demand that Jesus be crucified. Because there was this belief at that moment that you could call upon someone to be released and then this person be crucified. Now, Barabbas he liked to start trouble, but they wanted Barabbas released. And then that is when Pilate said, well, they actually said in Matthew 27, "His blood be upon us and our children." So Pilate hands Jesus over to be flogged and crucified. Now, it is at this point that Jesus suffers a severe physical beating. During a flogging, the victim was tied to a post, leaving his back entirely exposed. The Romans used a whip called a flagrum, and it consisted of small pieces of bone and metal that was attached to a number of leather strands. The strands was very long, and they would tie the bone into the strand, and there were multiple bones. There's a reason for that. When they would whip a person, it would go around the person's body and they would pull back. And as they pulled back, the bone would embed in the skin and it would rip the skin off of the body. It was quite gruesome. Now, the number of strikes is actually not recorded in the Gospels. The number of blows in Jewish law was actually set in Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 3 at 40. But it was actually later reduced to 39 to prevent excessive blows by a counting error. So the law stated that if a person was condemned to be crucified, then they would beat a person. So in other words, the victim sometimes died from just the beating alone. 39 hits was believed to bring the criminal one from death. So they would beat the person so viciously, but they would stop at 39, because if they were to exceed that, then the person would expire. Now, they would get in extreme trouble if, in fact, they did this, because if a person was condemned, then the crucifixion had to occur, because the Roman guards could get in severe punishment themselves if they flogged them to the point where the person expires prior to being crucified. That's why the centurion, the general or the leader commander came in and was screaming at them. The reason is he was screaming at them because they had whipped Christ so many times that he was no longer recognizable as a human being. And that's actually what Scripture says. So, and again, please understand, for those of you who are watching this, this is intense, but I'm not going to sugarcoat this, nor should we. So, flesh was hanging off of his body. Isaiah speaks of this, the suffering servant, where his beard was plucked. In other words, he was hit so harshly and violently that his skin would be hanging off of his face, and you could see the skull. So this is why Scripture says that they were so, it was unrecognizable, because they could actually see the backbone from the flogging. The amount of blood that he would have lost at this time would have been impossible for a human to sustain that type of beating and still make it to Golgotha. So the doctor that I spoke to said that he probably lost 40% of his blood just in the flogging alone. that by itself would make someone go into shock and expire. So that's one miracle, the fact that he continued. So here's how the doctor explained the flogging, because he's also a historian. And at first, the thongs in this, the whips, cut through the skin only. And then as the blows continued, they cut deeper into the subcutaneous tissues. And that would actually produce first an oozing of blood from the capillaries and then the veins of the skin. Finally, spurting arterial bleeding from vessels and the underlying muscles. So as the skin would tear, then the bones would be embedded into the muscle itself, and the muscle would be ripped as they pulled it back. So we're not just talking about flesh being ripped, we're also talking about the bones being deeply embedded into the muscle, and the muscles ripped along with the flesh. So they had small balls of lead on these whips, and it produces large, deep bruises, which are broken up by subsequent blows. And finally, the skin of the back is, quite honestly, it's hanging in long ribbons. The entire area is unrecognizable mass of torn, bleeding tissue. It no longer looks like a back, to the point where the muscle is exposed, as well as the shoulder blades. So you can see the actual shoulder blade. And when it was determined by the centurion in charge that the prisoner is near death, the beating is finally stopped. So the half fainting Jesus is then untied and allowed to slump to the stone pavement and in a bloody mess. As if that was not enough, again, keep in mind, he was punched in the face multiple times prior to this even occurring. Then the soldiers stripped and put a scarlet robe on him. This is important to note. The fabric at this time was quite heavy, and as Jesus was bleeding profusely from the back, and it was hot, when they put the robe on him, the robe then would stick to the body because some of the blood would dry up. So the robe now it's adhesive basically to the back. And so they twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on its head. And of course they put the staff on his right hand and knelt in front of him, "Hail, King of the Jews." So they spit on him and took the staff and then struck him on the head again and again, obviously, which would cause concussions. And probably at that time, a cracked skull. So he was then beaten by the Roman soldiers. They continued to beat him. And in mockery, they dressed him in what was probably a cloak of a Roman officer. And that was colored dark purple or scarlet. Now, they slammed the crown of thorns on his head. Unlike the traditional crown, which is depicted by an open ring, just the open ring, actually, many people believe that the actual crown of thorns may have covered the entire scalp. Thank you. The thorns that you see are between 1 to 2 inches long, and they're very thick, incredibly hard to break. So the gospel states that the Roman soldiers continued to beat Jesus on the head. The blows would have driven the thorns deeper into the scalp, one of the most vascular areas of the body, and the forehead, causing severe bleeding and extreme neurological pain. The doctor that I spoke to said that alone, even if he wasn't beaten, the crown of thorns alone being slammed on his head with millions of veins being affected, the neurological damage by that alone it would have been impossible for anybody to even walk, let alone carry a beam from a cross to Golgotha. There's no doubt in my mind, just from that alone, Jesus was more than a human being. A human being could not have endured what he endured and still walk from the Praetorium, or Pilate's Praetorium, to Golgotha. Golgotha, that's about 300 yards. So we're talking then 3 football fields that Jesus walked from the Praetorium with the beam all the way from the Praetorium to Golgotha. So when they took the scepter and they would beat the crown of thorns, they purposely hit him to the point where the thorns stuck so deeply embedded into the skull. So the neurological damage would have been impossible to comprehend. So finally, they tire their sadistic sport. Now, at this time, the robe is then ripped from his back. So you're talking about Jerusalem, where the sun, it is hot. The bleeding would have, some of the bleeding would have stopped or hardened, and the fabric would have basically, almost like glue, it would have stuck to his back. What they did is they took this cloak and then ripped the cloak from his back, opening up all the wounds all over again. And the bleeding would have been extreme. Now, so already having adhered to the clots of blood and serum in the wounds, its removal caused excruciating pain, just as the careless removal of a surgical bandage, and almost as though he were again being whipped. The wounds once more began to bleed quite fiercely. What's interesting is the severity of the beating is not detailed in the gospel. However, in the book of Isaiah, it says that the Romans pulled out his beard. I talked about that earlier. Isaiah chapter 50, verse 8. So they ripped his beard from his face. It would have been hanging down off of his face. It also mentions that Jesus was beaten so severely that his form did not look like a human being anymore. The little translation of the verse in Isaiah 52, verse 3 says, "So marred from the form of man was his aspect, that his appearance was not as that of the Son of Man." So you couldn't even tell he was a human being anymore. It also says people were so appalled to look at him because of the grotesque disfigurement. Now, from the beating, Jesus walked on a path known as the Via Dolorosa, or the way of suffering, to be crucified in Golgotha. Now, there's some debates. Some people are saying it's 300 yards. There's other historians that say, no, it's 650 yards. So if it's 600, let's just say 600 yards. Well, again, that's 6 football fields. So even if we were just to say, well, let's just say 500 yards, 5 football fields. It was a narrow street of stone. It was probably surrounded by markets in Jesus's time. And he was led through the crowded streets carrying what's called the crossbar. It's a crossbar. He did not carry the entire cross. That would have been far too heavy. The crossbar actually weighed between 80 to 110 pounds. So it would have been well over 300 pounds just to carry the entire cross. And really, that's not how they did this. So he would carry the crossbar that would go on his hands. And they placed that over his shoulders, keeping in mind that the crossbar is now rubbing against the very shoulder where flesh is hanging off. Okay, so it was about 80 to 110 pounds. And in spite of his effort to walk just straight up, the weight of the heavy wooden beam together with the shock produced copious blood loss, even more. he stumbles and he falls. The rough wood of the beam, it actually then gouged into the lacerated skin and probably came down on his neck, or certainly his head, where the crown of thorns were. So he tries to rise, but human muscles have been ripped apart and pushed beyond their endurance. So the centurion, anxious to get on with the crucifixion, he chooses a helper, Simon of Cyrene, to carry the cross. And Jesus follows, still bleeding, in complete and total shock. Clammy sweats of shock and probably still being whipped by the centurion to keep moving until the 650, or let's say 500-yard journey to Golgotha is finally complete. So Jesus is offered a wine mixed with myrrh. He refuses to drink. There are some historians that argue that this type of drink was to help with the pain, but I would disagree with that. It doesn't make sense to me that the Roman soldiers are so vicious, and then all of a sudden now they're going to say, oh, now we feel bad. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So Simon is then ordered to place the crossbar on the ground, and Jesus is now thrown backward onto his shoulders against the wood. At this time, there's no question his shoulders are broken. Some people say, however, I disagree, because it says in Scripture that Jesus, even through the whipping, did not suffer a broken bone. Now, the procedure of the crucifixion is as follows. The crossbar was put on the ground. The victim is laid upon it. The nails, they're about 7 inches long, with a diameter of is about basically a 3/8 of an inch. They were driven into the wrist. They were not driven into the palms. And the reason is because the palms wouldn't be able to support the upper body. Basically, it would rip right through the hands. So the wrist here is where, because there are 2 bones right here. And so the Romans were quite well versed in anatomy. And so they knew that if they here, then it would hold up the upper part of the body. So that's where the points would go into the vicinity of it's called the median nerve, causing extreme shocks of pain to radiate through the entire arm. So as the nail goes in, the hand would go immediately this way, and the nerves. Carpal tunnel syndrome is baby cakes compared to this. Complete the unbelievable pain that he would have experienced just from that alone would put someone in shock and probably cardiac arrest. So it was possible to place the nails between the bones so that no fractures or bones, even broken bones, occurred. So studies have actually shown that nails were probably driven through the small bone of the wrist, since nails of the palms wouldn't support the weight of the body. And by the way, in ancient terminology, the wrist was considered part of the hand in ancient terminology. And standing at the crucifixion sites would be upright posts called stipes. They stand about 7 feet high. And in the center of the stipe was a crude seat called the sedulum, which served as like a support for the victim. So the crossbar, the beam, was then lifted onto the stipes. And the feet, so basically what you would have is the person would be hanging, and then they would lift the person up while they were hanging. And then they would move the crossbar onto the stipe, the long bar, and slam it. So then the feet were then nailed to the stipe. And to allow for this, the knees had to be bent or rotated laterally and being left in a pretty uncomfortable position. the titulus was hung above the victim's head. So they probably, some people say there's a part in the ankle that they could have used, or even in the right in the middle of the foot. So now you have a nail that's either in the ankle or in the middle of the foot there. So as he pushes himself upward to avoid the stretching torment, he places then his full weight on the nail of his feet. And again, there's searing agony of the nail tearing through the nerves between the bones of the feet. And at this point, the arms fatigue. Now you have extreme, and many people don't think about this. At this point of time, Jesus is experiencing extreme Charlie horses. Cramps all over his entire body. There are great waves of cramps that sweep over the muscles. So on his calves, on his legs, on his back muscles, certainly in the shoulders, in the arms, his entire body is cramping up with extreme, if you would, Charlie horses. Knotting them in deep, relentless, extreme throbbing pain. And with these cramps comes the inability then to push himself up. So what they would do is, as your arms are spread out, they would push themselves up so they could breathe. They can get air in their lungs, and then they'd fall back down. And by hanging by his arms, the pectoral muscles are paralyzed. The intercostal muscles they're unable to respond. So air can then be drawn into the lungs, but it can't be exhaled. So Jesus fights to raise himself in order to even get one shorter breath. And then finally what happens is carbon dioxide builds up in the lungs and in the blood stream, and the cramps partially subside. So spasmodically, he's able to push himself upward to exhale and then bring in life-giving oxygen. So Jesus experienced 3 hours of this while on the cross. Limitless pain, cycles of twisting, joint-rendering cramps, intermittent partial asphyxiation, searing pain, where tissue is torn from his lacerated back and body as he moves up and down on this rough timber, to try to get air. Then, as if that's not enough, another agony begins. It is a terrible, crushing pain deep into the chest as the pericardium slowly fills with serum, begins to compress the heart. This is interesting because if you remember the 22nd Psalm, the 14th verse, I am poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted in the midst of my bowels. It's describing Jesus in the crucifixion. But now it's almost over. The loss of tissue fluids has reached a critical level. The compressed heart is struggling to pump heavy, thick, sluggish blood into the tissue. The tortured lungs are making a frantic effort to gasp in small gulps of air. And the markedly dehydrated tissues send their flood of stimuli to the brain. Jesus then gasps his fifth cry, and he says, I thirst. Now, one remembers another verse from the prophetic Psalm 22. Psalm 22 says, my strength is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue cleaveth to my jaws, and thou hast brought me into the dust of death. So a sponge that is soaked in posca, it's a cheap sour wine. That was the staple drink of the Roman legionnaires, is lifted to his lips, and he apparently doesn't take any of the liquid. So death by crucifixion would have come about in the following manner. The shallowness of breathing causes small areas of lungs to collapse. Decreased oxygen and increased carbon dioxide causes acidic conditions in the tissues. Fluid builds in the lungs, and that, of course, makes the situation worse. The heart is stressed and then eventually fails. So the slow process of suffering and resulting death during a crucifixion, I think, can be summarized like this. It appears likely that the mechanism of death in crucifixion was suffocation. The chains of events which ultimately led to suffocation are as follows. With the weight of the body being supported by the sedulum, the arms were pulled up, and this caused the intercostal and pectoral muscles to be stretched. Furthermore, movements of these muscles was opposed by the weight of the body. With the muscles and the respiratory thus stretched, the respiratory bellows became relatively fixed, and the victim was forced to raise the body off the sedulum, thereby transforming the weight of the body into the feet. And when the pain became unbearable, the victim again slumped down on the sedulum with the weight of the body pulling on the wrist and again stretching the intercostal muscles. Thus, the victim alternated between lifting his body off the sedulum in order to breathe and then slumping down on the sedulum to relieve the pain in the feet. And eventually he became exhausted and he lapsed into unconsciousness so that he could no longer lift his body off the sedulum, the seat. And in this position, with the respiratory muscles essentially paralyzed, the victim suffocated. And due to the shallow breathing, the victim's lungs begin to collapse in small areas, causing hypoxia. And fluid build up in the lungs. And under the stress of hypoxia, the heart fails. And there are several different theories on the actual cause of death. One theory states that there was a filling of the pericardium with fluid, which put a fatal strain on the ability of the heart to pump blood. Another theory actually states by a medical expert says that Jesus died of cardiac rupture. So the actual cause may have been a multifactorial, event. So now the body of Jesus is in extremes, and he can feel the chill of death creeping through his tissues. And this realization brings out the 6 words: "It is finished." And his mission of atonement is completed. And when one last surge of strength, he once again presses on his torn feet against the nails, straightens his legs, takes a deeper breath, and utters the 7th and last cry, "Father, into thy hands I commit my spirit." Now, to confirm that the victim was dead, the Romans inflicted a spear wound through the right side of the heart. So they knew exactly what they were doing. They were piercing the heart. And when pierced, a sudden flow of blood and water came out of Jesus's body. The medical significance of the blood and water has been a matter of debate. One theory states that Jesus died of a massive myocardial infarction in which the heart ruptured, which may have resulted from his falling while carrying the cross. Another theory states that Jesus' heart was surrounded by fluid in the pericardium, which constricted the heart and caused death. And the physical stress of crucifixion may have produced like a fatal cardiac arrhythmia. And the stated order of blood and water may not necessarily indicate the order of appearance, but rather than relative prominence of each fluid, they pierced the heart sac. And that is how, in fact, Jesus died. So even for those of you who may not be Christians, mocking the crucifixion says a lot about that person. Because even if you don't accept Jesus as a Messiah, the fact that you can mock this type of suffering that he actually endured, that's pretty scary. Jesus endured all this in the flesh. So at the very least, I think even if you're not a Christian, show respect for the sanctity of life. And even if you can't do that, then quite honestly, I don't believe there's any humanity left in a person. So that is what the crucifixion, as from a medical perspective, is pretty intense, as you can see. Now, let's talk about the Shroud of Turin, which you guys can see here, and you guys can see right there. Well, right there. Again, a friend of mine, a clergy friend of mine, placed this on the Shroud of Turin when it was on display. So that was actually placed. The Shroud of Turin, there is absolutely, without question, no doubt in my mind, none, that the Shroud of Turin is legitimate. 100%. No one can convince me otherwise, and I'll tell you why. So let me explain, for those of you who don't know what the shroud is. The Shroud of Turin is a long linen cloth made out of flax and measures about 14 feet long. Thank you, Joe. And 3.5 feet wide. It bears the faint image of a bearded crucified man with blood stains that match the wounds of the crucifixion Jesus suffered, as all reported in the Gospels. It has been in Turin since 1578, well over 400 years. And prior to that, it was in France for another 200 years in 1356. It has been preserved and revered for centuries as the actual burial cloth that's wrapped around Jesus that's recorded in the Bible. It was owned at 1450 to 1982 by the Royal Savoy family until the former king of Italy, Umberto II, passed away and willed it to the Catholic Church. So the shroud has been on display for numerous public exhibitions over the past 650 years. Now, the history to its arrival in France is not continuous, and therefore critics have alleged it was the work of medieval artists. Incorrect. 100% incorrect. And anyone who says this is intellectually dishonest. The discovery of a key document in 1993, a Hungarian Pray manuscript dated in 1192, confirms that the shroud was in Constantinople and stolen by crusaders in the Fourth Crusade. So this bridges the gap between 1204 and 1356, when the shroud's whereabouts was in question. And some say that it was in possession of the Knights Templar, who participated in the Fourth Crusade, were said to venerate a mysterious image. Now, the finding is monumental because it validates a historical trail to at least to the year 544, when the image, not made by hands, was discovered in Edessa in southern Turkey, became the genesis of a Byzantine Orthodox icon, images of Christ that followed. Now, 2 coins were minted in 692 under the reign of Emperor Justinian II. And they were the first coins ever minted with an image of Christ and appear to be based on the shroud image. And in 944, the cloth was taken from Edessa to Constantinople. And the sermon delivered by Gregory, the archdeacon, clearly describes a full image on the linen. In the 11th century, Greek chronicle John painted a picture of the same event as part of an illustrated manuscript. It clearly shows the general of the army presenting a long linen cloth with an image on it to the Emperor Romanus I. Now, the science, because that's what we need to talk about. In 1898, the shroud was photographed for the first time, and the first pictures led to the discovery that the image on the cloth is actually a negative. The image becomes a positive in a photographic negative. And this discovery startled the scientific community. And in 1931, there was another, it was photographed the shroud again with a more advanced film technology, confirming that the shroud is indeed a negative image. Now, in 1950, Dr. Barbet, it's a prominent French surgeon, published a doctorate at Calvary documenting 15 years of medical research on the shroud image. He described the physiology and pathology of the man as a shroud as anatomically perfect. 1973, Max Frey, a noted Swiss criminologist, was given permission to take dust samples from the shroud, contained much pollen. He discovered 22 pollen species from plants that are unique to areas around Constantinople and Edessa, and 7 pollen species from plants common only in Israel. Thank you. And the pollen trail appears to corroborate the historical trail. 1975, Air Force scientists John Jackson and Eric Jumper used a VP8 image analyzer designed for the space program. And this is what really shocked people. It discovered that the Shroud image contained encoded 3D data, not found in ordinary reflected light photographs. And that discovery indicated that the cloth must and had to have been wrapped around a real human figure at the time the image was formed. In 1978, the Shroud was on public exhibit for the first time, and in 1933, and was displayed for 6 weeks. So 1980, National Geographic magazine published a landmark article on the Shroud, further propelling the cloth into the science limelight, calling one of the most perplexing enigmas of the modern times. In 1980, the same year, Walter McCrone, who was not a part of the Shroud project, was given several fibers to analyze. And after finding iron oxide particles and a single particle of paint, he broke ranks from the Shroud scientists who had agreed to make all findings public. McCrone proposed that the Shroud was a painting, a red ochre paint, created from iron oxide particles suspended in thin binder solution. However, McCrone's finding is no way agreed with any of the highly sophisticated tests. By the way, his claims have all been dismissed. It turns out that the iron oxide is a natural result of soaking the linen for days. It's called retting, where iron ions from the water attach to the fibers and oxide. So, in 1981, after 3 years analyzing the data, the Shroud of Turin project research made their findings public. All the scientists agreed. We can conclude for now that the Shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist. The blood stains are composed of hemoglobin and give a positive test for blood. In 1988, the Shroud was carbon dated by 3 laboratories, Oxford, Zurich, and Arizona. They indicated a date range from 1260 to 1390, indicating that the cloth had only been 700 years old. This earth-shattering news seemed to contradict the Shroud's authenticity. However, in 1997, a prominent Israeli botanist and a professor of Hebrew University confirmed the presence of a flower images on the Shroud. He verified 28 different pollen species and plant images. Many are from plants that grow only in Jerusalem. 2002, the Shroud was restored to remove charred debris from the fire in 1532. This is what they're not telling you regarding the 1988, or in this case, when they said it was dated in 1260. In 2002, the Shroud was restored to remove charred debris from the fire in 1532 to aid in the cloth's preservation. So all the burns and patches from 1532 fire were removed. The Shroud was attached to a new backing cloth as well. In 1997, and certainly in 1988, the particle that they took from the Shroud was the repair that was done to that caused the fire. There was a fire in a monastery, and the outer parts of the Shroud was burnt, and nuns repaired that, and they took that fabric from the Middle Ages, not the middle part that was not burnt. So in 2004, a textile expert revealed that the stitching of a seam on the Shroud that nuns, that ruins the entire length, known as the side strip, is typical of Jewish burial shrouds found in Israel. 2004, chemical research on the image fibers offers clues as how the image was formed. The entire cloth, is covered with a razor-thin layer of carbohydrates that adhere to the linen after being soaked in soapweed detergent as part of an ancient manufacturing process. Something has interacted with this carbo layer, resulting in a discoloration of the cloth near or in direct contact with the body. And in other words, something miraculous happened that the image of the body caused this image to be on this cloth, an extreme light, an extreme power source of some kind. So where the image then appeared on the cloth. 2005, thermal chemist Ray Rogers followed upon a new spectroscopic data showing that the material on the corner cut for carbon dating may be different from the rest of the shroud. He obtained thread samples from C14 corner and thread samples from the interior shroud. Additional microchemical and spectroscopic tests showed the samples were not the same. Results published in a peer-reviewed journal confirmed the initial concerns. The cut for C14 data appears to be from a medieval reweave instead of the original shroud. So in other words, as I just mentioned, when they do the carbon dating the first time, they carbon date it from the outer garments. And absolutely, because it was damage to the shroud in the 15th century. But the radiocarbon sample was not part of the original cloth of the Shroud of Turin. The radiocarbon date was thus not valid. So the carbon labs violated the original sample. And 3 samples were cut. And ignoring caution from archaeologists, they cut the sample from the most handled area of the cloth, which again showed 15th century. In 2011, European researchers were able to replicate the depth of the coloration of the shroud image using 40 nanosecond burst from a UV laser. It's the first time any aspect has ever been reproduced using light. In 2013, researchers with a university in Italy, using multiple samples from other linens of unknown range to the area 3000 BC, were able to develop a predictable rate of chemical and mechanical decay. Comparing fibers from the shroud, they determined that the shroud was estimated date range of 280 BC to 220 AD. So therefore, the actual burial cloth was not in the 15th century. It's actually dated 280 BC to 220 AD. The results also found in the 2013 research, 1, they found no inorganic pigment present, no substances manually applied to the cloth, no artistic substances are on the cloth, no collagen binder as would be used with paint, blood test positive, and the blood, by the way, is AB positive with human DNA. Which is absolutely conclusive. So the Shroud of Turin conforms to what is known about the first century Jewish burial practices using a single linen shroud. Strips of linen were only used to tie the hands and feet. The textile analysis indicates an ancient origin. Threads were hand spun, and the cloth is pieced together in narrow bands, with each hank of yarn individually bleached. All indicate an origin earlier than the Middle Ages. If a shroud wrapped a human corpse, as several medical forensic specialists believe, and if it originated in Israel, which it did, as many botanists believe, then can it ever be proven to be Jesus? Well, yes. Yes. 1, people who were crucified were not, the crown of thorns was not placed on their head. That was not a common practice at all. That was only reported in Jesus' crucifixion. The abrasions and bruises on the face, the wounds on the side, listen to this, there were over 120 whip marks found on the shroud. Over 120. There was blood on the arms, nail wound to the wrist, nail wound to the feet. The legs were not broken. That's important, and I'll tell you why. Most of the times, what the Roman guards would do, the soldiers, is they would break the legs of the person who is being crucified. Sometimes, because they weren't whipped as violently as Jesus was whipped. Sometimes it would take 2 or 3 days for a person to pass away from crucifixion. So what the Romans would do is they would take a huge hammer and they would break the legs. The reason is they did that is because then the person who's being crucified couldn't lift up and get air in the lungs. Jesus' legs were not broken. Also, it does show post-mortem blood flow from side wound and on the back. The legs are pulled up due to rigor mortis, and the blood is from actual wounds and show evidence of gravity from a vertical position, crucifixion. So there's no question in my mind, based on the science alone, on what I've just presented to you, that one, the carbon dating originally was flawed because they took it from the outer garments of the shroud. And again, as I explained, in the Middle Ages, it was kept in a monastery and there was a fire. The outer part was fixed. It was repaired in the Middle Ages. But the actual shroud itself is a 3D image. Even if you were to argue that this was fake, one, there is no paint. There's no paint found on the shroud. None. Two, it would be humanly impossible in the Middle Ages. They did not have the technology to do a 3D image as you see on the shroud. They didn't have it. It didn't exist. And even just now, today in the 21st century, we have that technology. That technology didn't exist. So what was miraculous about the shroud is, number one, it shows all the wounds that Jesus endured. It absolutely shows the crown of thorns placed, you see, no question, on the head. And the scourging on over 120 whips, scourging. What is so profound about this image is that a burst of light, as the scientists explain, that a burst of light had to be so intense and hot that there is no way to actually explain that type of energy, that this 3D image was then placed on this shroud. So from there, and absolute from that perspective alone, no doubt in my mind, there is no doubt in my mind that the Shroud of Turin is 100% the burial cloth of Jesus. It would not have been the burial cloth of anyone else, because no one else in any of the historical documents of crucifixion is showing that anybody else was beaten as viciously as Christ was, especially with the crown of thorns. Nobody. And that, my friends, is your presentation on the crucifixion. Yeah, the crucifixion, when you look at it and you break it down, you see the unbelievable agony. Again, the agony in the garden alone. You know, Jesus experienced a profound spiritual anguish. And I can't even imagine. And not only that, but obviously betrayal. So now you're sweating blood because you know what's about to happen, and then one of your closest friends that you love betrayed you. It's just unbelievable, unbelievable. So that, my friends, is our presentation, and hopefully, I'll turn on the chat. I'm kind of concerned about that. be nice, TikTok. Just be kind. Don't be rude. And then we'll let everybody chat. Okay? All right. Now, yeah. Oh, I'd like to see that. I'd like to see that, Kathy. Kathy says an AI picture of Jesus. They use the technology from the Shroud to create it. Oh, yeah, yeah. Yeah, I've seen that as well. And pretty intense. All right, thank you guys. And don't forget, I want to remind everybody that, and we're not finished. We still have some the show to continue. This Sunday at 6 p.m. Obviously, it's Easter, and I'm going to have mass, but it will only be on TikTok. It's at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So if you I know some people may not have a church community. You're more than welcome to join us. We would love to have you. Thank you, Alexander. You're more than welcome to join us this Sunday. It is our Bible study. We have Bible study at 8 p.m. Eastern. So if that's Bible study on Easter and Mass. So absolutely, Maria. Yeah. Yeah, no question. Okay. Yeah, a lot of people want, and I know today, look, I get it. Today is Paranormal Fridays. And we'll get back to our paranormals, but today obviously is a special day. I also want to make this announcement, and this is a big announcement. I am fascinated. This is just me, but I'm fascinated with life in North Korea. Well, not hell that we're thinking about. So Christ descended into Hades, basically those who have passed on prior to Jesus appearing. So I'm really very intrigued with people who live in North Korea and the whole North Korea regime, and because you see people crying at funerals. And I had an opportunity on TikTok. I was flipping through TikTok, and I saw a gentleman who escaped North Korea twice. And I asked if he would be willing to join us and do an interview and talk about what life is really like in North Korea. What do the North Koreans really believe about the Kim Jong-un and the Kim Jong family, and what is life really like? And he has agreed to be a special guest on this show. So it will be a Friday. We haven't 100% whatever. Charles, I'm just going to block you. Seriously. I mean, you're going to complain that I'm actually giving a presentation on Good Friday? Really? Go away. Anyway. So we are going to have him on a Friday show. And I'm really looking forward to that. So, and we won't be here next Friday. And so there we go. Okay. Sub chat on for the rest of the show on TikTok. Sorry. Not interested. Couldn't even take sub chat off for 5 minutes. Let that sink in. People ask me all the time, am I afraid of demons? What am I? No, I'm not afraid of demons. What frightens me is that a priest is talking about Good Friday. And then people actually say, why are you on here talking about Good Friday? Are you a real priest? Are you this? Really? Really? I did a presentation for you on Good Friday. See, what actually frightens me more than demons is how people can be so incredibly hateful online and judgmental, and then lay their heads on the pillow at night and not give a second thought of the things that they've said, during the day. That's frightening to me, because as human beings, we're supposed to be more compassionate. And that to me is a problem. Matthew chapter 7, verse 2 says, you're going to be judged in the same manner you judge others. Okay. So anyway, sub chat on is for the rest of the night. If you don't like it, speak to your therapist. Yeah. What we talked about how we just talked about how Jesus died. And and keep in mind, people always ask, Jesus saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that proves that Jesus is not the Son of God. No, not at all. No, actually, that's incorrect. Jesus was praying. Jesus was praying. Yeah, some people don't know this. We know he was praying. Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? That's how it starts. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? So far from my cries of anguish. My God, I cry out by day, but you do not answer. By night, I find no rest. And it continues, and it continues. Many bulls surround me. Strong bulls of Bashan encircle me. Roaring lions, they tear their prey, open their mouths wide against me. I am poured out like water. All my bones are out of joint. My heart has turned to wax. It has melted within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd, and my tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You lay me in the dust of death. Dogs surround me. Pack of villains encircle me. They pierce my hands and feet. All my bones are on display, which they were, as he was flogged. People stare and gloat over me. They divide my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment, which they did. But you, Lord, do not be far from me. You are my strength. Come quickly to help me. Deliver me from the sword, my precious life from the power of the dogs. Rescue me from the mouths of the lions and save me from the horns of the wild oxen. And then it continues. All the rich of the earth will feast and worship. All who go down to the dust will kneel before him. Those who cannot keep themselves alive, posterity will serve him. Future generations will be told about the Lord. They will proclaim his righteousness, declaring to a people yet unborn, he has done it. Psalm 22, he was fulfilling prophecy. Psalm 22. He was praying. Not only praying, he was fulfilling prophecy. In Psalm 22, it describes everything that Jesus endured. And it ends with, he has done it. Okay. Oh, yeah. I'm not worried about the trolls. I have sub chat only on. And sub chat only is going to remain on for the rest of the night on TikTok, because I'm not going to allow people who are demonically influenced to come in here and disrespect this very special and holy day. Yeah, there's a lot of people. Some people say that the centurion said, truly, this is the Son of God. Or this was the Messiah, Okay, so if you guys have any questions about the crucifixion, I'll be more than happy to answer that. Why did Jesus have to die? Yeah, well, the centurion, we see this in Mark chapter 15, and even the Gospel of Matthew. And so says, truly, this man was the Son of God. And we see this, so. Yeah. Okay. What is this? Hold on one second. Bear with me. I'm trying to look through them. I gotta get my reading glasses. Hold on, everybody. That's what happens when you get old. It's hard to see these things. They're so small print. Okay. Yes. I'm getting old. Okay. let's see, Psalms or song. Yes. No, he wasn't singing. He was praying. Yeah. So the folded napkin. Okay. So there was a fold. So there was a part, a head part of the linens. The story of the folded napkin is often associated with an interpretation. It involves Jewish customs of the time, but the interpretation, some people are debating that interpretation. The passage comes from John chapter 20, verse 6 through 7, where it describes how Peter and John entered the empty tomb of Jesus and found the linen cloths lying there and the napkin, which had been on his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. That's what you're referring to. I look a day over 30. Well, thank you, but I'm in my 50s, so I appreciate that. So the interpretation has grown around the scene, suggests that the folded napkin relates to a Jewish dining custom. So according to the story, a servant would know that he could clear the table if a master was done with his meal, if the napkin was wadded up. However, if the master left the table and folded the napkin, it meant that he was coming back and the servant would not touch the table. Thank you. And this has been used like a metaphorical indication that Jesus was signaling his return. But the customary interpretation does not have a really a strong basis in historical documentation by a lot of historians. The Gospel of John does not elaborate on any such symbolic meaning. The focus might be on demonstrating that Jesus' resurrection was ordered and deliberate, as opposed to like a chaotic, hasty event. But it is an interesting. I do understand the history there. So, sin. All right. So let me answer the question. Why did Jesus have to die? God must deal with sin because of his holy and just nature. He has no option to ignore sin, or even to forgive sin without an appropriate penalty being paid. Sin has a very steep price that someone has to pay. And the payment is a sacrifice. And fortunately for us, a proper sacrifice appeases God's wrath. But also, it's a covenant that God made. And God always completes the covenant. So God did for a time employ the animal sacrifice system to appease the covenant. However, that was only a temporary system. It was never intended for an eternal solution for our sins. Hebrews chapter 10 says this. It was actually a type of sacrifice to help prepare the minds and hearts of those who would eventually trust in God the Savior. So the animal sacrifice is no longer a viable option for paying the cost of sin. God could have chosen another course of action instead of Jesus' crucifixion. But in order to forgive our individual sins, now come to think of it, there is an optional way to attempt to pay for our sins. We simply ignore the responsibility to our Creator God, and when our life is complete, we'll be sentenced to eternal punishment. So since the people who chose this method are imperfect, their sacrifice is imperfect. The cost of the sins will never be paid, which is why the sacrifice is eternal punishment, separated. So Jesus' sacrifice is the only way. So Jesus' crucifixion and sacrificial death is the sole eternal solution for a person's sin. God required a perfect sacrifice to pay the price for all sins. So God the Son, who is also the Son of Man, is the only person qualified to pay the cost of sins. He was the unblemished Lamb. He had no sin nature, nor did he ever commit a sin. He was and still is the unblemished Lamb. Jesus told him, I am the way, the truth, the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. So Jesus' crucifixion was sacrifice enough to pay for all sins ever committed in the history of the world. So theoretically, every person in history could have been forgiven for their sins based on Christ's crucifixion and sacrificial death. And it's sad that very few people accept that. Yes, on the third day. Now, a lot of people argue that the resurrection is just nonsense. Well, it says Jesus descended into hell, but technically it's not hell that we're thinking of. It's Hades. It's the abode. Basically, it's where people who have passed away and they were at rest in Abraham's bosom, and prior to the Messiah coming, and then the Messiah then preached to them. But we're not talking about the eternal hell at fire dam. We're not talking about that hell. So here's what I know. Here's what I know for a fact. No ifs, ands, or buts about this. And no one, even the most staunch atheist, cannot refute this. And that's this. Jesus' disciples were, for the most part, laborers. Crucifixion was, thank you there, Jeff. Crucifixion was terrible. Remember, they saw their Messiah being viciously crucified. That in of itself was terrifying. And understandably so. And because they were with Jesus and his disciples, they were terrified that the Pharisees could say, aha, these people need to be put to death too, because they were saying he's the king of the Jews. That was insurrection. And insurrection, that would have been death. So the disciples knew full well that their life was in danger. And it was. So we know that these people were terrified. And again, understandably so, after they just saw Jesus, whom they loved deeply, being crucified. Remember, you also have to remember that their idea of a Messiah was to overthrow the Roman Empire. So from birth, they were taught that the Messiah would show up and overthrow the Roman Empire. Well, now they absolutely say, yeah, this is the Messiah. This is the Messiah. And now Jesus is crucified. So they have put all of their faith into Jesus, whom they believe was the Messiah, and they saw him terribly tortured. And now they're thinking, what have we done? Now they're going to come after us. But here's what I say this. Something miraculous happened. Some amazing miracle happened on Sunday, where these very same men that were terrified, and understandably so, thank you, they were something so miraculous happened that they then walked out and started preaching that Jesus rose from the dead. They knew full well the moment they did this, they signed their death certificate. They knew it. And my friends, we'll talk on Sunday about their deaths. And it's pretty barbaric. And they knew full well what was going to happen. But something miraculous happened. And Scripture, thank you, Donna. And actually, Scripture says over 500 people saw the resurrected Jesus. Now, here's the deal. Here's what I find fascinating. And I want to say this too. Anybody who tells you that Jesus somehow survived the crucifixion, that is the most idiotic, intellectually dishonest thing anybody could possibly say. That goes beyond, that's an ignorance on a level that I'll never understand, because that's not true. Jesus couldn't, first of all, the Roman soldiers wasn't going to allow that to happen. They couldn't. Because if in fact Jesus survived the crucifixion, the Roman soldiers would have been put to death. So there was no such thing. There is a 0% chance. And even, let's just say, even for some crazy, even conspiracy theory out there, that somehow Jesus did suffer and he did struggle and he was crucified and somehow he managed to survive the crucifixion. There is no way that Jesus would have been able to walk a couple days later. That's just idiotic. That in of itself is it's so illogical. Even if we just entertain the ridiculous notion that somehow Jesus survived the crucifixion, he wouldn't have been able to walk. His feet were nailed to the cross. So it is preposterous. It's so intellectually dishonest for anyone to even entertain that idea. That to me is just that's beyond ridiculous, unbelievable. But this is what we do know. We do know that Jesus died. And we do know that he was pierced in the side. That in of itself, he couldn't have survived. I mean, you're piercing the heart sac. You're not going to survive that. So even if somehow, which is ridiculous, he survived the crucifixion part, he wouldn't have survived that. If you pierce the heart sac, even in today's time, you're dead. So we know that for a fact. Jesus died on the cross. No ifs, ands, or buts. Something happened. Something happened on that Sunday where these men that were terrified walked out and said they saw the resurrected Christ. And they knew at that moment that was it. They knew they were, oh, thank you. They knew they were next. So there you go. So that's the answer to that question. And I'm trying to, but listen, here is a really interesting, there's, again, just even to entertain the idea that Jesus somehow survived the crucifixion. First, that in of itself is just so ridiculous, but nonetheless. Right. I mean, infections he would have received. You understand. But listen to this. Let me hear what, let me tell you what this article. This is by T.K. Randall. The Garden of Eden allegedly lies beneath the Great Pyramid of Giza, engineer claims. Dr. Borisov, thank you, believes that he has pinpointed the whereabouts of Adam and Eve's biblical paradise. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dustin. The precise location of the Garden of Eden continues to remain a topic of debate and intrigue among historians. Thank you, guys. And religious scholars. Clues as to its alleged whereabouts can be found in the Bible, which reference 4 rivers flowing: Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates, as well as the land of Cush, now Ethiopia. So this has led to the general consensus that the Garden of Eden was situated in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, though not everyone is convinced by this interpretation. Now, computer engineer Dr. Borisov has published a new study in which he contends, rather controversially, that the Garden of Eden is not in Mesopotamia at all, but is in fact the site of the Great Pyramid in Egypt. His research involved combining mythological symbolism with geographical analysis of the region. Quote, examining a map from around 500 BC, it becomes evident that that the only 4 rivers emerging from the surrounding ocean are the Nile, Tigris, Euphrates, and Indus, he wrote. And it's clear that the pyramid itself resembles the sacred tree of life. I think that's a stretch. But Dr. Borisov's conclusions have certainly generated some heated debate, although there is still nothing definitive to link the Great Pyramid with the biblical paradise. All things considered, we'll probably never know if there's any truth to this theory or not. So there we go. If you've not heard about this, this guy is claiming that's where it is. Who knows? Who knows? Okay. I want to share a couple of real life, speaking of miracles, as we talked about the Shroud of Turin, which is miraculous. And certainly the crucifixion in of itself is miraculous. And I say it's miraculous because the fact that Jesus was so viciously beaten and lost that amount of blood. There is no other human being. No human being could possibly lose that much, 40% of his blood, and at the same time maintain consciousness to walk 500 yards. And on top of all of that, don't forget the crown of thorns. So you have this extreme neurological pain that would have been unbearable just to walk, just to move your head, let alone walk. So just from a biological, just from a medical perspective only, the fact that he was still able to walk 500 yards in of itself is a miracle. Now, speaking of other miracles, I'm going to share a couple other miracles with you that you may not have ever heard of. And this is a really interesting, this is by Jody Smith, the 1917 Miracle of the Sun, S-U-N. So May 1917, children returning home from shepherding reportedly encountered an apparition of the Virgin Mary in Fatima, Portugal. She allegedly told the children of her plans to appear on the 13th day of the next 6 months, prompting the kids to rush home and tell their parents of their vision. People hoping to see the Virgin Mary at the appointed time gathered in Fatima to watch a miracle. October 13, 1917, the Virgin Mary appeared only to the children and predicted the end of World War I. And as the story goes, she then presented the 70,000 in attendance with a silver sun to clear the stormy skies, which was actually written in the paper at that time. It says the silver sun was seen to whirl and turn in the circle of broken clouds. A cry went up from every mouth, and the people fell on their knees on the muddy ground. The light turned a beautiful blue, as if it had come through the stained glass window of a cathedral and spread itself over the people who knelt with outstretched hands. The blue faded slowly, and then the light seemed to pass through yellow glass. People wept and prayed with uncovered heads in the presence of the miracle they had awaited. The seconds seemed like hours, so vivid were they. And that is a reporter who was there. Non-believers and believers alike provided eyewitness accounts for daily newspapers across Portugal, corroborating the movement of the sun. Some theories suggest, of course, that the event was a mass hallucination brought on by fervor and the need to see something unexplainable. The problem with that is there were quite a few skeptics there that were no longer skeptics. There's other miracles, the incorruptible bodies of saints that never decay. In the early 20th century, saints known as incorrupt were discovered with preserved bodies. Some of these saints decomposed after their final resting places become unsealed, allowing everyday microbes and contaminants to end their time of untouched perfection. So believers in the miracle of incorrupt saints stay undeterred in their faith, feeling assured that God blessed his servants with bodies that remain in pristine condition after death. Now, coinciding with the church's decision, wherein the scientific discoveries that most of the saints underwent a mummification process as part of their preparation for burial. Other saints, meanwhile, had the luck, the author says, of being kept in chilled vaults that put off decay. But a number of saints were scientifically proven to have no special condition in their final resting place, nor any preparation to preserve them after burial. Saint Zita received a full examination via intra-body camera by scientists working under pathologists of the University of Pisa. They found no sign of post-mortem cuts or preservation methods on or in the corpse. And at least 3 other saints are also inexplicably preserved. So Blessed Margaret of Savoy, Saint Savina Petrilli, Saint Ubald of Gubbio. Also, there is a miracle of Our Lady of Lourdes and the healing water, which is, I believe, absolutely is a miracle, no question. In 1858, in Lourdes, France, a 14-year-old girl named Bernadette lived with her family in an abandoned prison. Bernadette went with her sister and her friend to collect firewood on February the 11th. She lagged behind due to asthma and found herself alone at the grotto, while the other girls had already crossed the cold stream. According to Bernadette, as she worked to remove her socks and shoes, gusts of wind issued from the grotto before a blinding light followed. A woman dressed with white robes with a blue sash, yellow roses on her feet, and a rosary in her hands appeared to Bernadette and encouraged her to pray. And Bernadette's companions did not see any of this and brushed off her account or vision. She visited the woman daily over the next 15 days, despite police intervention and her parents' disapproval. On February the 25th, the woman told the Bernadette to drink from and bathe herself in the fountain, but there wasn't one. So the girl dug with her fingers until she found an underground water spring that still flows today. It cannot be explained. 3 days later, the woman told the girl to build a church on the land, but the local clergy dismissed her until 1862, when they officially decreed the Virgin Mary had indeed revealed herself. Millions flocked to the spring annually, and the Medical Bureau of Sanctuary claims upwards of 7,000 visitors have received complete healing from their ailments by immersing themselves in the spring. Each cured person submits their transformation to the Bureau for scientific authentication before leaving the holy grounds. Of the 7,000 reports of healing since 1862, 66 remain completely unexplained by science. Bernadette became Saint Bernadette after committing herself to a life of servitude as a nun, and is one of the incorrupt saints recognized by the Catholic Church. That's pretty powerful, isn't it? Let me share another one, which is really powerful. At the Catholics, we believe in a term called transubstantiation. Transubstantiation means we believe that the communion, the host, is the true, the full humanity and divinity of Christ. So there was a miracle. The consecrated host refers to some people as wafers in Holy Eucharist. Catholics believe that the wafers, along with the wine, turn into the actual body and blood of Christ during their priest consecration. And the wafers reside, we call them, the Eucharist, in a tabernacle until retrieved for Holy Eucharist or other designated times outside of Mass. 16 months after a 2016 earthquake in Italy, a priest claimed he recovered 40 consecrated hosts from the Our Lady of Assumption Church. The priest said he found the host container had fallen in the quake, but the lid remained intact. He maintained the host showed no signs of mold or staleness about them after almost a year and a half being locked in the rubble of the tabernacle. And the nuns who made the host confirmed nothing but flour and water was in the wafers. That's unbelievable. And we'll do one more. The weeping statue of Our Lady of all nations in Akita. This is an amazing story. The statue of Our Lady of all nations in Akita, Japan, was carved from a Judea tree in 1963. The miracle attached to the figure relates to the deaf sister Saint Agnes, who reportedly saw bright lights and angels near the statue's altar in June of 1973. During prayer before the Virgin Mary statue, stigmata appeared on Sister Agnes' hands and recurred for 3 weeks. According to the story, Sister Agnes returned to the statue of Our Lady of all nations to pray and heard the Virgin Mary speak. Sister Agnes continued praying in front of the statue, and it revealed its own stigmata in its carved hands. After this, the statue began to sweat a rose-scented liquid that the nuns of the order collected. In January of 1975, the figure started weeping, and so did on multiple occasions until September of 1981, with one such episode airing on television. Allegedly, not only was Sister Agnes cured of her deafness in 1982, but a visitor was also cured of her brain cancer in 1981 after praying in front of the statue. By the way, the liquids the statue produced underwent scientific testing by 3 different researchers starting in 1975. The first professor at Akita University determined the samples were blood, sweat, and tears. The sweat and tears were type AB, and the blood was type B. The second test, performed by a forensic scientist who was not a believer, gave the same results. A later examination revealed the fluids to be type A and AB, and the blood type O. But unfortunately, the samples had allegedly become contaminated after the handling of time throughout the years. But we know for a fact through scientific, because everybody's science. Okay, they did scientific testing. And the samples that were collected from the statue, and they actually collected them, sealed them when it was, they have this on recording. They actually, because people say, well, they could have faked it. They actually did it, sealed it, and then sent it off, immediately gave it to the scientists to test. So there was no faking it. There was no, well, we'll pick our finger or poke our finger and put, nope. They actually collected it in a vial. The scientists took it from them, and they did the testing, and it was actual blood, sweat, and tears. That is unbelievable. Unbelievable. So this is on this, very special Good Friday. Hopefully you have enjoyed this. I always try to make sure that Good Friday is, I always present the Crucifixion, the Shroud of Turin, but I also like to end with documented miracles. And hopefully, maybe if you're struggling with your faith, maybe you get so angry with denominations because denominations are so focused on money and power and exclusion. And maybe that's why you've turned away from Christianity. But keep in mind, that's not Christianity. And I've said this before to my friends in Bible study. This is Christianity. When Jesus' flesh was hanging off his body, when the crown of thorns was slammed on his head, when he was beaten multiple times with the rod, with the soldiers hitting him in his face, and his beard actually hanging off of his face. And he was unrecognized as a human being. They couldn't recognize him. I'm absolutely convinced that the only reason that he got to Golgotha is because he was thinking of you. One more step for Bill. One more step for Mark. One more step for Abigail. One more step for Gina. One more step for Laura. One more step for Judy Ann. One more step for Tracy and Jax. Jennifer. One more step for you. I'm absolutely convinced that he thought of you every step. For those of you who are listening to this on podcast, I say good night to you and have a wonderful evening. I want to remind everybody that don't forget, we do have night prayer coming up at the top at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard. This will be podcasted. And so I'm going to do this right now. Okay. I'll just Sacred Division. Okay. We'll put that in there. That way you guys can have it. So I'll publish in just a second. So anyway, at 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, TikTok, I'll be with you guys in just a second. Remember, at 10 p.m. Eastern, we're going to come right back on air for night prayer. So please join us for that. My friends on Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Twitch, Instagram, and KGREDB, remember I always say to you, your value does not decrease based on someone's inability or refusal to see your worth. Jesus has already told you and convinced you through his crucifixion and resurrection that you are priceless, and never let anybody tell you or convince you otherwise. Good night.